Moscow didn't just get rattled, it got exposed. February 7th is the timestamp Russia can't erase. In one coordinated wave, Ukraine reportedly sent 20 ballistic missiles, 10 cruise missiles, and hundreds of kamikaze drones into Russia's airspace in what was described as the most complex strike since the beginning of the war. And it didn't stay in one place. Belgorod, Bryansk, Saratov, Kursk, Novorossiysk among them. While 8 regions were described as taking fire as Neptune and Flamingo missiles pushed the chaos outward. But here's the twist. The real rupture wasn't the noise across 8 regions. It was the hit reported right next to Moscow, Redkino, in the Tver region, at an experimental chemical plant tied to something far more strategic than a warehouse. I'm Andrew Collins, and you're watching my channel. Before we go further, take a second to like, subscribe, comment, and share. It tells the algorithm this story is worth spreading, and I want to hear your take as the details emerge. Because if Redkino is what the accounts suggest, then February 7th wasn't just an air raid. It was a strike on the next wave of strikes before they ever launch. The fuel described in these reports isn't standard jet fuel. It's called desaline, elsewhere described as desaline M, and it's described as high-density, energy-efficient, and tied to the missiles and bombers Russia uses for long-range attacks. The claim is blunt. Redkino is the only large-scale producer of this fuel. So if that facility is knocked out, the replenishment rate of a strategic missile stockpile doesn't simply slow, it risks collapsing. There's an even sharper claim. The main target was a magic additive used in the engines of Kh-101 and Kh-55 cruise missiles. Without it, the narrative argues, nuclear-capable bombers either can't launch those missiles properly or the missiles fail before reaching their targets. In this framing, the goal wasn't to chase a missile in the sky. It was to hit the chemistry that makes future launches possible. Now ask the obvious question. How does an operation like this get through so close to Moscow, past a defense network built to look untouchable? The explanation offered is tactical pressure, decoys, saturation, and altitude. Russian air defense doctrine, built on Cold War logic, is designed to catch fast aircraft and high-altitude threats. But Lyuty and Beaver drones are described as doing the opposite, flying below the radar horizon, skimming over treetops, using nap-of-the-earth routes that stay under scanning thresholds while billion-dollar radars search the wrong slice of sky. Then comes the swarm problem. Pantsir systems are described as being overwhelmed by volume. A Pantsir battery can only lock onto a limited number of targets at the same time. The story claims Ukraine pushed cheap and fake targets first, forcing defenders to burn attention and ammunition. Once batteries were depleted or disoriented, the kamikaze drones carrying the real punch arrived at targets that were suddenly exposed. Add to that the claim that Russia's electronic shield was breached and GPS jammers were rendered ineffective, and the picture tightens. This wasn't one lucky gap. It was a short-range layer failing under modern pressure. The aftermath is described in a way meant to prove it wasn't superficial. NASA satellites are said to have recorded massive heat signatures at the factory that did not subside after midnight. Heat patterns described as consistent with uncontrolled combustion of high-octane chemical compounds. Eyewitness accounts circulating on social media described secondary explosions, suggesting the strike reached more than surface buildings, hitting underground fuel storage tanks and high-pressure chemical reactors. Redkino itself is described as a technology hub operating since 1902, producing more than 40 unique chemicals for the Russian aerospace industry. That matters because it widens the impact beyond one weapon system. This is framed as a choke point where military production and civilian industry collide. And once that node is damaged, the consequences stack fast. First, the logistical choke. Kh-101 and Kh-55 are described as central to Russia's long-range terror against Ukrainian cities, and those missiles are described as dependent on desaline M rather than ordinary fuel. If Redkino is the only large-scale producer, then even a temporary shutdown becomes a strategic shortage. At a unit cost of $1 to $2 million, missiles become expensive hardware with a missing lifeline. The production line impact is described as a 10 to 20% delay, or even a complete halt. Second, the sanctions trap. The facility's modernization is described as dependent on Western technology, distillation towers, high-pressure reactors, precision chemical analysis devices of European or American origin, which are now described as reduced to molten metal. Sanctions make access to original parts impossible. Experts are described as saying a return to full capacity would take 6 months at best, but in a realistic scenario, years. Third, the economic bleed. The factory employed approximately 1,000 people. Repair costs are estimated between 1 and 3 billion rubles. And because the facility supplied 40 different chemicals to military and civilian sectors, the story claims Russia's civil aviation and space industries face a chemical crisis layered on top of a spare parts crisis. But February 7th didn't stop at Redkino. That same night, the Black Sea's logistical hub, the port of Novorossiysk, was also described as being hit, with oil terminals catching fire. The narrative insists this isn't coincidence. Pressure in the north near Moscow, pressure in the south through the port, forcing chaos in the Kremlin's resource distribution. Now zoom out, because the scandal isn't only what burned, it's what didn't stop it. For years, Russia marketed S-300, S-400, and Pantsir systems as impenetrable shields. The Tver strike is framed as proof these systems struggle against modern asymmetric and saturation methods, cheap drones punching holes in a defense network built for a different era. And that damage isn't only military, it's reputational. The question becomes brutal. Who spends billions on an air defense system that can't secure a strategic facility near Moscow? This is where the psychological shock hits the elite. Tver is described as the corridor between Moscow and St. Petersburg, Moscow's backyard. If drones can operate up to 130 kilometers from the Kremlin and strike a strategic facility, what does that say about the villas in Rubliovka? The narrative describes a quiet panic, money and families routed toward Dubai or Istanbul, until rats are abandoning the ship stops being a metaphor and becomes the reality of private jet traffic at Moscow airports. Strategically, the story argues Russia is being trapped by its own size. Protecting a vast territory of 17 million kilometers means every factory and warehouse becomes a potential target. Neither air defense missile stockpiles nor budgets can cover everything. That's the asymmetry Ukraine is exploiting. Drones costing a few thousand, forcing Russia to defend billions in strategic capital. The same asymmetry shows up in the return on investment claim. The operation is framed as a high ROI strike, a fleet consisting mostly of domestically produced drones costing less than $5 million in total, and crippling assets worth vastly more while reducing missile projections for the next year. In this telling, Redkino isn't just a fire, its future launches erased. That matters immediately for Ukraine's defense. If hundreds more K-201 missiles are eliminated before they're even born, pressure on limited Patriot and Iris-T systems drops. It buys breathing room at the front by shrinking the risk of death from above. And the message to Ukraine's allies is framed as just as important. Decision makers in Washington, Berlin, and London are described as watching this and learning something simple. Russia's red lines are bluffs. A strike on a strategic facility 130 kilometers from Moscow did not trigger the Kremlin's nuclear threats in this narrative. Instead, it exposed vulnerability. NATO intelligence is described as confirming that Russia's air defense umbrella is full of holes, and deep strikes erode Russia's capacity to fight. There's another layer that turns Russia into a risk for its own partners. The production of desaline is described as requiring sensitive chemicals and refinery equipment dependent on Western technology. With Redkino burning, Russia's options narrow: halt production or go to China and India and beg for strategic chemicals. The script frames the trap as this: U.S. secondary sanctions. Supplier countries risk becoming targets if they trade in strategic military chemicals. One strike can turn Russia into a toxic partner in the eyes of its allies. And that's why February 7th is framed as a point of no return. Even if the smoke over Redkino clears, the psychological damage doesn't. People in Tver waking up to sirens are described as feeling the victory stories were lies. Local telegram channels are described as overflowing with anger and fear despite censorship, asking where the air defense is, where the army is, and why they're burning. Ukraine, in this telling, didn't just damage an industrial site. It pushed the war into Russia's home space, factories, logistics, and the mental bubble around Moscow. The loudest fear in the capital becomes simple: if this could happen here, where is the next target? Now, before we close, subscribe, comment, and share. It helps the channel reach more people, it keeps these deep dives coming, and I read your comments to decide what we break down next. So what do you think February 7th really proved? A one-night shock, or the start of a permanent shift in what's possible?